Welcome to the lecture series of the We Go Smart City Champions. I'm the Dr. Byung-Jun Kim. I'm the professor of the public policy and vice president for international affairs at Kookmin University. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to introduce today's lecture. Today's lecture's topic is data management ethics and culture. To me, this topic is very important. Many people thought that smart city is quite driven by the technology, and everything is related to the only technology things to resolve the urban problem. But more important thing is more than the not only for the technology tools. It is about the culture. It is about the ethical issue and public value. So today's lecture is very meaningful, and I hope you can learn a lot of things from today's very acknowledged professors. Having said that, let me introduce today's lecturer. Dr. Matteo Tarantino is a professor at the Catholic University of the Milano, where he teaches data, information and society, and information and communication systems. He's also a lecturer at the University of Geneva, where he teaches cities in transition and urban futures. His research focuses on the nexus between culture, data, and sustainability in cities. He has collaborated with several UN agencies, including UN ECE, WHO, and UN Habitat. He is currently the coordinator of the Urban Digital Tech thematic area in the Federated Innovation Network within Milano's Innovation District project. Now, let me invite Dr. Matteo Tarantino.
A good day to all of you, WeGo participants. It is my great pleasure to be here today and share some knowledge about data management ethics and the concept of data cultures. My name is Matteo Tarantino, and I work at the Catholic University of Milan and the University of Geneva, where I work on data, cities, and sustainability matters. So today's lecture is about how to think about the greater common good in matters of data related to cities. And I'd like to start with a quotation from the EU GDPR, which is the law framework which protects individual rights in matters of data. And I think this is the guiding principle of data ethics for urban governance. And it says that the processing of personal data in general should be designed to serve mankind. So in the GDPR, this kind of ethical concern is at the root of the entire framework. And we'll see today some of the facets of this, some well-known and some less well-known areas in which ethics play a role in data management in the context of the new sustainable, inclusive cities that we are striving to build. This is of key importance for new urban leaders, for new data leaders in a datafied world. It is extremely important for young people who are right now building the skills, honing their knowledge that will allow them to drive future cities, to have at least a background and a building block in terms of data ethics. The new world that the new young leaders, new young leaders are facing, it is a world that is very different from the one that previous generations of urban leaders had to face. Number one, we saw a drop in the cost of data acquisition and processing. It is now very, very cheap to collect and manage high amounts of data, what we may call a democratizing of sensing, of capturing data. This is also helped by the high penetration of sensors in our daily life, most notably in our mobile phones, which led to a social acceptance of quantification. Pretty much all of us know that we are constantly producing data about ourselves that is being captured by somebody else, which raises a lot of ethical concerns in themselves that we are going to see. And what can we use all this data for? Well, the parallel drop in cost of data acquisition has been paralleled with a rise in automatic decision making. So the use of AI, broadly intended as the technologies that augment and help decision making through algorithms to make decisions more efficient in the short or long term. So again, this can be seen as a democratization and a broadening of the potential of data. It used to be impossible for economically, socially weaker subjects to use high-level statistics to inform decision-making because they simply didn't have access either to the data or to the means of aggregating and analyzing this data. And right now, while this democratizing potential should not be exaggerated, right now we are looking at a world in which pretty much every our smart cities in big inverted commas notion since at least the mid-90s. This idea that the more you bring data into decision making in a city, the more just, objective, transparent, fair your city will be. In this enthusiasm, because data processing and data capture are cheaper, are broader, and are easier to do. In all this enthusiasm, ethics seems to be relegated to a peripheral role. The idea is that data is somehow neutral to all of this and is mostly a matter then of ethics of decision making. What do you want to do? What effects will it have? And today, in this 15 minutes, I would like to share with you that data is not neutral at all. And there are several key ethical concerns in data management for sustainable cities that young leaders absolutely need to incorporate. Again, some of them will be known to you and some will be less known. Why are we bringing up ethical concerns? Aside from the fact that, ethics, what is ethics really? Ethics is the science of deciding what is good or what is better in a certain context. So aside from the obvious point that ethical concerns are right for decision makers, there are some other implications of adopting an ethically oriented data decision-making framework. And the first of them is that in the long term, it's better for everybody. So ethical approaches tend to maximize in the long term the sheer co-benefits of data-driven decision-making, which means that if you adopt an ethical standpoint properly informed, it will make you think long-term and it will make you maximize the benefits of data-driven processes for the broader amount of people, and especially the broader amount of previously hitherto marginalized and vulnerable people. The second is that ethical concerns make our thinking more future-oriented, because ethical concerns, and there are several cases in the news in the past 5 years that show this, ethical concerns reduce future risk. Ethical concerns allow you to build your processes, your institutions in a way that they will withstand many risks that will come in the future. Again, in the news, you can see many examples of huge IT corporations facing severe crisis of value because of lack of ethical concerns, or rather, not lack of ethical concerns per se, but the lack of ethical thinking. This idea of anticipating concerns in the future by strengthening your ethical core. The third implication of adopting an ethical approach to urban data related matters is political. So the more transparently ethical our approach is, the stronger the trust between us as an institution and our citizens will be, and also between us as a private sector operator and our customers will be. Now, urban governance, as I'm sure you will face many times in this course that we are participating into, urban governance in the 21st century requires constantly the building, the strengthening, the maintenance of a trust bond with citizens. Now, this trust bond is very hard to gain nowadays, but very easy to lose. And the more transparently, strongly, recognizably ethical your approach is, the stronger it will be, and the more resilient this bond will be. And finally, an implication that is seldom considered: ethical standards, once they are adopted, force our processes, bureaucratic, technological, epistemological, whatever, political, to innovate in order to adapt to these standards without losing efficiency. So in order to be more ethical with a system, we need to tweak the system. We need to innovate in a way that preserves both our economic or political sustainability. We don't want to be run out of market. We don't want to lose elections. We want to keep our citizens happy. But at the same time, while sticking to ethical core points, we want, and to do that requires, in most cases, an innovation. So your systems evolve around ethical concerns, can evolve around ethical concerns. So now let's focus on the concrete. What are we talking about? What are we thinking about when we talk about data ethics? Well, there are three main domains in which ethical concerns are being developed nowadays. The first is data collection, so the act of seizing the data, the act of grabbing the data. So the question here is, how do we extract data and from whom? And we'll see in detail in a moment what we mean. The second domain is data analytics. Once we have the data, we aggregate it, we analyze it, we try to get models from our data. So the question here becomes, how do we employ data? For what ends? And the third domain is data disclosure. So we have this data, we aggregated it, and now who can see this data? Who has access to the data? Both the raw data that was the starting point of our process, and the aggregated data that we produced. Who can look at it? Who can access it? So let's start from data collection. Data collection, as we have seen in the introduction of this lecture, has benefited a lot from a drop in the cost of automatic data collection. There are sensors everywhere now. It's very easy to incorporate sensors into appliances or any kind of appliances. And this allows a significant amount of passive data collection. So data that is collected without the user or the subject having to do anything, having to fill in a survey, for example, or having to answer to an interview, having to talk to you in any way or form. Passive collection of data, because of this drop in the cost of sensors, has become right now the largest pool of the data in the industry, in the world. And this raises significant concerns. So when we collect data, when we capture this data, it's always a matter of balancing between poles, trying to find trade-off. The first trade-off is the trade-off between individual rights, the core of which is the right to privacy, to being left alone, as it is sometimes phrased in the jurisprudence, and the societal benefits. So the good that capturing this data does to everyone, at least potentially, versus the right of the individual to be left alone. Another way to express this trade-off is to frame it as the value of data. So let's say the empowering potential of this data versus the invasiveness. So the level of intrusion that our data collection mechanisms will have on the life of people. Now, data collection is one of the topics around which the highest debates and the most visible debates in data ethics develop. So it looks almost like data ethics is only a matter of, can we collect, grab, extract this kind of data from this kind of people? But that is a very reductive notion of data ethics. Still, data collection also being the starting point of the whole process of any data-related process is and remains a core focus of data ethics. So we can express the data collection ethics concerns around three key questions that you need to ask yourself when you start any data collection procedure. Number one, is the subject being informed in any way that her data is being extracted from her? Second, can the subject opt out of the data collection? We need to make sure that to the fullest extent possible, it is not always possible, but the subject can opt out if she chooses so from the data collection mechanism. A core domain, for example, in which it is impossible to opt out is mobile phone data, traffic data. This is one of the largest, most useful domains of data that we can have today. It's fully passive. It's the data that is generated simply by people going around and using their mobile phones without even looking at what they are doing in particular. Just the fact that we are going around connecting to cell phone towers originates a lot of data that can be used to map density, movement, and so on and so forth. And we cannot opt out of that. It is extremely hard to opt out of that, and is not usually doable by the individual citizen. And this leads us to the third question, which is, what are we giving this person in return? Are we collecting this data in a way that will eventually benefit this person, even indirectly, by enhancing society, improving the living condition of people? Or are we extracting data from this person, possibly without her consent, just to produce economic value? So the question is, are we giving this person something in return? This is a concern that is not secondary at all, because we are extracting value from this person in collecting data about her behavior, her opinions, or any other form of data extraction. And if we are not providing a commensurate return to this person, again, it can be indirect. It can be improving the living conditions of everyone, and thus indirectly improving the living condition of this person. But if we are not even asking the question, what are we giving this person in return, we are effectively exploiting this person. And when people find out they are being exploited, they react very angrily. So even well-intentioned approaches to data collection and data extraction can fail if these simple rules of trust building are not followed. And again, on data collection, I want to raise a concern that is seldom raised in discussion about data ethics. So, is data quality an ethical responsibility? We collect data, right? And then we store this data somewhere into databases. And we can have high quality or low quality data. I'm sure you will have lectures in this course dealing with this, or there is extensive literature on data quality. So are we under any ethical concern, any ethical obligation of producing high quality data? I mean, aside from the needs of the organization, our institution, we are building these data sets for? And the answer is yes. there is an ethical obligation towards producing data with the highest possible quality. And why is that? Well, some work, research work, including some that we have done, and you will find in the references section at the end of this presentation, has shown that low data quality raises the cost of aggregating this data, of bringing it together, possibly, especially when it's the case of bringing it together with data produced by other institutions, other subjects. So you want to bring it together, to synthesize it, to take good decisions, to maximize the quality of your decision making. But since the data is low quality, then the cost of aggregation becomes very high. And people, I mean, the subjects collecting the data most often do not care. I mean, they collect data for their own purposes. So maybe it's bad quality data, but it's usable for the institution that is collecting it. But then when it's shared with other institutions, it becomes unusable or difficult to integrate. And this is a significant problem, especially for weaker and more vulnerable subjects that may need to aggregate this data. For example, NGOs, developing countries, poor municipalities, as opposed to rich cities, for example. In our research, we have found this is often the case for rural municipalities versus cities. So they get this data from either the cities or the ministries, and it's bad quality, and they cannot aggregate it in a way that is meaningful. So they are left out from the potential of this data. And particularly, the concern is not only for today's institutions, today's weaker subjects, but also we build data also for the future. Our data will be used in the future to perform readings of our current situations that will inform future decisions. So we need to produce data with the highest possible quality now, also to preserve the power of this data in the future for our future colleagues, the future leaders, the future decision makers, but also the future NGOs, the future activists. We need to build high quality data. Otherwise, these subjects will not be able to use this data. So what does it mean to produce high quality data? Well, again, I can only give a brief outlook here, but it means trying to produce data that is accurate, and this is pretty straightforward. So our data needs to have as few errors as possible. B, it needs to be complete. So if we are mapping something, a phenomenon, we need to make sure that our data reflects all the necessary aspects of this phenomenon. If we are mapping, for example, air quality in a city, we need to make sure that our data maps all the pertinent pollutants that may be in the air. Third, it needs to be consistent. And this is, I'm putting it in bold and underlined because this seems to be a secondary concern. But what does it mean to be consistent? It means that the data need to use all the same formats and conventions across our data. If something is labeled in a certain way, it needs to be labeled in a certain way across all the data. If some conventions are used, for example, in how date and times are expressed, they need to be consistent. Otherwise, the cost of aggregation will rise. It needs to be accessible. So people who may need this data need to be able to access it in the easiest possible way. We speak about data access in a few minutes. And of paramount importance, it needs to be interoperable. So rather than building just new data for the sake of new data, we need to make carefully sure that the data that we are building speaks with existing databases, existing data sources, so that aggregation then can be as smooth as possible. Instead, what we mostly do when we build data is we build data for ourselves. And then as a secondary concern, we say, okay, we'll give it to other people, to other institutions, and it's their matter, it's their business to adapt it to their system. Whereas we need to be a little more holistic in the way that we conceive our data. Second, area, second domain, is data analytics. So when we synthesize, when we aggregate our data, here again is a very vast domain, and we can only provide some pointers. So pointer number one is black boxing. The way we manipulate data, the way we aggregate, we synthesize our data, trying to find insights from our data, is dependent on algorithms. They can be very simple, like means, averages, up to very complicated clustering and other forms of algorithms. But the question is, can we show them should the need arise? Are our aggregation, our synthesis, analytic techniques auditable in case and transparent? And this cannot always be the case. There are cases in which our algorithms may be trade secrets, maybe our core assets. So we cannot just divulge them to the public. But if we are a public institution, we need to make sure that our aggregation techniques, our analytics, are auditable and transparent, and any citizen can look into how things are calculated in a way that is accessible to them, even to persons who are not engineers. Second, are we aggregating, analyzing data in a way that can be harmful to people? What does it mean here? When you aggregate data, so you bring together data from different domains, you can make it in a way that in some contexts can endanger people. Typically, when you, for example, join together data coming from, for example, political opinion polls or social media monitoring with personal data, matching together profiles of people, those profiles can become harmful to people in other contexts. For example, people may have unpopular political opinions, and if this comes out, it can be damaging for them. Another example is gender and gender orientation. Taking things together, aggregating these variables can lead to risks to people, maybe not today, but can in the future. So the question we need to ask here is, what level of granularity of data do we need? Do we really need to be able to identify people from our data? Is that necessary in any way or form to what we are doing? Do we really need to have names and surnames connected to whatever variables we are looking at? Or can we work at a higher level of aggregate data? Can we fully anonymize our data, for example, through encryption of individuation variables? Those are questions that we need to ask. We cannot just give for granted that because now our data is non-problematic, it cannot be in the future. So we need to analyze data in a way that is always, remember what we said at the beginning, future-oriented. Third, we analyzed our data, so some decisions will be taken on the basis of our data. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, the decisions that are taken on the basis of our aggregate data, what is their impact on society? Are they harmful or beneficial? And if they are harmful for the majority of people and only beneficial for a very, very, very little group, are we using data to empower the wrong people or to skew societies in a way that are less sustainable and less inclusive than what we would like? These are questions that need to be asked not after having analyzed the data, but those are all questions that need to be asked before analyzing the data. And the analytics that we build need to be designed with this in mind. I'll give you a quick example. Facial recognition technology, which has by now reached a level of maturity which is significant. So the algorithms that recognize people from extraction of features of their faces. This technology can theoretically recognize gender. So it can recognize with some degree of certainty whether the person that the camera is framing is male or female biologically. But more and more, this option is being phased out of APIs, so application programming interfaces offering this kind of services. So even large vendors, very large companies offering this kind of services are increasingly taking out gender recognition from the catalog of features they offer customers. And this is because of the debate, the ongoing debate about gender identity, of course, and therefore that applying a label like male or female to the subjects may be, in some contexts and for some people, harmful or stressful. So they are just phasing it out. So because these concerns, again, in the long term, tend to be more costly later than now to be incorporated into decision making. The third area of data ethics is data disclosure. So in our sustainable city, we collect data all the time because of these cheap sensors that we deployed everywhere. And now we have this data, we analyzed it, so we took our decisions. And the question is, who do we allow to access this data? And there are several strategies for this. The key question here is, can access to our data empower other entities? And are those entities in need of being empowered in society? So there is data that is technically available, but should not be disclosed to people, or should be disclosed only to specific targets, so to specific groups of people. There is, for example, a raging debate about security in cities, about the disclosure of crime data in a granular form. So with the rap sheet of felons, of criminals, should it be public in any way? Of course, there are multiple voices in this debate, and it's not our concern right now to take a stand in this process. But the question that we need to ask is, again, the privacy of the individual versus the value for society of disclosing this data need to find a trade-off. We, as a general principle, as a society, as a culture, in most of the countries today, we tend to think that the broader transparency of data, broader transparency of data is better. So the more transparent we are with our data, the more people can access our data, the better it is in terms of balancing institutions, public and private, and in terms of other forms of benefit, for example, innovation. So we fund continuously open data initiatives in which data is made available in bulk to people. There are several good examples. The London data store in the UK is a good example of what a city can do. There are several other examples across the world. What a city can do when it puts its mind in to providing its people access to data about the city itself. But open data is not always the right solution. There are contexts in which we would want targeted disclosure. So the data is available only to specific groups of people and not to the overall population. And second, sometimes the benefit of disclosing data, of making data available, are not immediately evident today, a point that we already raised and will raise again before we finish this lecture, but will become evident in the future. So we today, like in every period in human history, we produce a lot of data and then we discard. We just throw it away. We don't see a value for the data today. And in doing so, in throwing away this data, because storing data has a cost, of course, right? And then you need to concern yourself not only with storing the data, but also making it secure, and impeding unlawful access. And so there is a significant effort entailed into making data available to other people. So we tend to select only some kind of data that we think is necessary, and the rest we throw away. But that data may be extremely useful in the future. So making data available today just for the needs of today may be short-sighted. We may want people to have access to data that right now looks useless, but will become useful in the future. We just cannot see it now. At the same time, we need to allow people access to data that doesn't allow individuation of subjects to the largest extent possible. We need to find, again, a way of disclosing this data that makes this data as accessible as possible. It's useless to have an open data repository that is unusable by people, which is often the case in many countries where you have hyper-fragmentation of data disclosure. So every city does it in its own way. And then, again, collating this data, aggregating this data becomes extremely costly. So data disclosure is not just an end in itself. Let's just make as much data as possible available to people, provided it's anonymized, but it also entails design concerns. So we need to make our disclosure to be fully ethical. Our disclosure needs to be not only present, but also as efficient and respectful as possible. A final theoretical point I'd like to make with you is the point of data cultures. What are data cultures? Data cultures are the ensemble of norms, perception, practices, power arrangements, and so on, through which we make sense of data. So we are in an office, we work with other people. Our office has a certain data culture. We think some data is relevant, some data is not relevant. We use data in a certain way. For example, we print out everything and then we mark it with colored markers. Or maybe we use Microsoft Excel or other spreadsheet software to manipulate most of our data. And also, we consider certain kind of knowledge to be data and certain other kind of knowledge not to be. All of this makes up our data culture. And every group of people has its own data culture. Every office has its own data culture. And then every institution tends to have its own data culture. Data culture is the operating system, so to speak, of any data-related practice. So it's like the underlying layer in our brain that regulates what we do with data. And our data cultures are socialized with us like any other culture. So we start working in an office, we learn the local data culture, right? How to do things, how to think about things. Why is this relevant? Well, first of all, data cultures are not alone. When you take data culture, so the way we think about data and the way we conceive data and we work with data, along with the data infrastructures, so the machines that we have at our disposal, the software that we use, the kind of connections that we use, you have our full data ecology. The data ecology is a system, as any system, it keeps changing and it can be changed, but it also, like any system, have inertia. So it tends to perpetuate itself over time. Why is this relevant to our discussion on data ethics? Well, because data ethics are costly. So to implement data ethical concerns, especially if they were not integrated in our data governance from the beginning. This is often the case with young companies, for example, right? We focus on making money. We focus on economic sustainability because otherwise we run out of business. So all of our data governance and our data cultures are oriented towards profit, towards performance, right? So then fast forward a few years, and then we want to integrate ethical concerns because we became successful, and now the government is paying attention, society is paying attention. And the problem is that implementing this data ethics can be very costly and cumbersome. I can give you a few examples. Because of the GDPR framework in the EU, for example, it is now effectively illegal to circulate Excel files via email with names of people who signed up to follow, for example, a university seminar. You cannot do that anymore, right? So to change the way that we process that kind of data is cumbersome. So you need to adapt things that maybe you've been doing for 15 years and change them. Now, in implementing ethical concerns in data, of course, what is called tone of the top is important. So it comes down from the top, and the fact that the top of the management of the leadership of our institution or company signals that ethical concerns are now an integral part of the company or the institution culture is important. However, data ethics, if they are just signaled from above, often remain purely abstract and do not really penetrate the way that we do things, because what happens, and again, our research has shown it in several contexts, is that you have ethical concerns at the top, and then when you get down to the level of the people actually doing the work, they keep doing things, we keep doing things the way we always done it. And then when we know there is an audit or an inspection, then we quickly change things in order to comply, and then we go back again to doing things the way we were. So this is the problem of data cultures, the problem of implementing ethical concerns into data culture. You can have all the tone of the top that you want about the importance of ethics, but then you need to get down as a leader to the level of the actual person sitting at a computer and doing the things, the daily work of people. A real leader, especially a leader of tomorrow, is the leader that sees the whole process of this. So now, how to do it is an open challenge. We do not have the time today to go into some of the measures that you can use, but it's very useful to, for example, establish milestones and gradual transitions into the data cultures of institutions and offices, rather than trying to implement abrupt changes, because abrupt changes will lead people just to reject them and do their best to have a double way of doing things, one that complies with your ethical concerns and another that maximizes their own efficiency, whereas what you want is that their efficiency and the ethical concerns are one and the same. So this takes time. This is just an example, but this concern needs to be in the mind of any young leader. The fact that it's not just enough to put down rules, but you need to establish a mechanism so that they percolate into the local data cultures. However, and this is another open challenge, we live in highly decentralized countries most of the time, so you have very fragmented datascapes in which each institution basically uses its own data management system as different and often incompatible data cultures with other institutions. So this fragmentation makes it very difficult, especially in the public sector, to have an efficient percolation of ethical concerns from the top down to the level of people actually doing the work. And this is something that we need to address, and there is still not a proper answer to this problem. Before concluding, final point. You may not be an engineer. You may not think that how a database is designed is your concern. You may think that how to actually build the database upon which all of your data-related efforts run is not your concern, or is a concern of efficiency that is best left to technical people. However, you need to think again long-term if you want to include ethical concerns in your doing. And the problem we are facing is that of database inertia. So what happens is this. When you design a database, so you choose which variables will become part of your records in the database, for example, how your database is structured, how it is connected, and so on and so forth. Once you do it, once the database is designed, particularly in the case of relational databases, which are the vast majority of databases today, once you do that, those decisions tend to stick. So the database tend to get inertia, and the paradox is that the more successful you are, so the more data you incorporate in your database, the higher will be the cost of changing the structure of the database in the long run. I think you have all lived this in your life. So if you build an Excel sheet for whatever you want to measure, and then if you put in 10 lines of records and you want to add a new variable, you can do it. But if you put in 50,000 rows of data and then you want to add another variable, so you need to go back and change it for 50,000 records, you'll think twice about doing it. Now imagine this at the level of complexity of institutional or even citywide databases. So the more successful we are, the harder will be in the long run to change our databases. And this is also why many institutions are still running on legacy databases. The banking sector is ripe with them, databases that were built in the 70s or in the 80s. So the point is that if your database was not built with ethical concerns at the beginning, think again about individuation and whether or not you need to know the full family name and first name and social security number of each of the people in your database. Now, if this was built this way back in time, then it becomes harder later on to change it and extremely costly. Which means that we need to integrate ethical concerns at the level of design of databases, or we will face troubling challenges down the road. Conclusion, the bottom line. Number one, you are set to be the young leaders of the cities of tomorrow. And we really need you to break away from the way things have been done so far. So far, we have had approaches to urban data that have been honestly, mostly performance obsessed, even well-intentioned. So how can we maximize the quality of life of our citizens, for example? But they were mostly ethics agnostic. So they were like, oh, we'll measure the ethical component of what we do in terms of the good that we make, right? And this is not sustainable in the long term. What I mean is that I am a data guy. I love data-driven decision-making, and I work on that every day, day in, day out. But what I see is that if we lack the ethical commitment now, our data-driven decision-making systems will be weaker in the future, will be more open to attacks from forces in society that do not want data-driven decision-making for whatever reason, and would like to rely mostly on opinion-driven decision-making. So for the good of smart and sustainable, inclusive cities themselves that need to be based upon a high concentration, high density data ecology, for the benefit of that, we need sometimes to trade off some efficiency in what we do and integrate ethical concerns. So we need to do it now, but we need to do it for the future. Again, and this will be the last time I raise this point, performance today versus resilience in the future is bad business in the long term, especially if you're running a city. So you as young leaders, you need to look beyond the attractive showcasing potential. So, hey, look, we are doing this very exciting data-driven project in our city that, of course, has economic and political benefits. But you need to look in the long term, integrating some of the ethical concerns that today we only had the space to hint to into your own decision-making processes. Because what can happen is that even well-intentioned approaches, data-driven approaches to sustainability in the urban context that, however, failed to properly integrate ethics from the beginning into their design and conceptual phase, end up in the long term being more costly to the agendas of urban sustainability than what would have been a slower, more ethically concerned approach. We sometimes, when we are tech enthusiastic, we tend to skip corners, to cut corners, and we say, okay, we'll skip this ethical corner here for the benefit of performance, of granting the better quality of life to our people. And then everything comes crashing down later when ethical concerns become either from a legislative point of view or from a social point of view, or eventually from an economic point of view, become cogent, become powerful. And then the cost on our sustainability agenda is so much higher, and it discourages future attempts in this sense. There are many experiences of failed smart cities that failed precisely on this, on the fact that they were not forward-thinking enough, which is very bad for leaders which are tomorrow's leader for tomorrow's city. And our shared responsibility towards building more resilient, more sustainable, more inclusive cities cannot skim on the ethical concerns of data. Thank you very much for your attention. I remain available to discuss these topics at any time, and the organization also has my contact. I thank again WeGo for providing me with the opportunity of sharing some thoughts on this matter, and I look forward to our future engagements and wish you the best for the prosecution of this course. Thank you very much and have a good day.